Catholic Radio Network.
He is risen. He is risen indeed. Welcome again to Call to Communion here on EWTN Radio. This program is just for you if you're a non-Catholic. If you've got questions about the Catholic faith, we're here to get those questions answered as quickly as we can, but as thoroughly as necessary. Here's our phone number, 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. If you're listening outside of North America, please dial the number 1 and then 205-271-2985. And, of course, you can always send us an email. The address for that, ctc@ewtn.com. Charles Beery is our producer. Matt Kabinski is our phone screener. Jeff Burson handles social media for us. If you want to ask a question via YouTube or Facebook, we're streaming on both those great platforms right now. Just put your question in the comments box. Jeff will see it. He'll shoot it to us here in the studio. We would love to get that question of yours answered on today's program. I'm Tom Price along with Dr. David Anders.
Tom, how are you today?
Very well. How are you, my friend?
I'm doing decent, thank you.
You're still partying because it's Easter, right?
Partying?
Well, partying, yeah. I know that you're not the average party goer, but you are still rejoicing.
Rejoicing would be a better description, yeah.
Very good. Here's a question from Jeff in Massachusetts who says, Happy Easter. First of all, actually two questions here. For a family consisting of a Catholic parent and a Protestant parent, how can they best coexist and respect each other's faith? For example, attending 2 church services on each Sunday. Is this feasible? And secondly, Dr. Anders, as a former Protestant, did you ever consider joining the Episcopal Church? I think it's a Protestant denomination that's probably the most Catholic, if you will. We love having you as a Catholic, but I was just curious about that, if you had ever considered joining the Episcopal Church. Happy Easter. God bless. Jeff in Massachusetts.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. I really appreciate the question. When it comes to living in a divided house, we have one Catholic parent, one Protestant parent. I think it's incredibly important to respect the other person's position and their conscience, and you don't want to proselytize your spouse. There is a danger in this kind of interreligious situation, and the danger is that one party says, well, what we need to do is we need to agree on a kind of least common denominator Christianity, and unless you're fairly savvy, that can subtly default to Protestantism, because I think this is incorrect, but there's a way of conceiving Protestantism as simply less elaborate and complicated than Catholicism. Like we Protestants have the Bible, you Catholics have the Bible and all this other stuff. So since we have the Bible in common, why don't we just default to the Bible? And the problem with that is then a lot of times what gets snuck in under the rug is a Protestant conception of biblical authority and a Protestant interpretation of the meaning of the Bible. And so it's sort of a crypto-Protestantism sneaks in as the default religion of the house. And so I would be on guard against that in terms of your own practice and the education of your children. And I wouldn't concede a kind of crypto, lowest common denominator Protestantism as the religion of the home. I mean, I'd want to be free to live a robust Catholic life and to expose my children to a robust Catholic life. Can you go to 2 services every Sunday? Is that feasible? Well, that's really a question for your own family dynamic. I mean, that's a lot of church services.
It is, and some may find it unsustainable.
Exactly. That's really something you got to work out for yourself.
Sure. All right. Well, thank you so much. Glad you're listening to us.
Did I consider becoming an Episcopalian?
Yes.
The answer to that question is no. I never considered becoming an Episcopalian. I have Episcopalian friends. I've visited Episcopalian churches. I've studied the Book of Common Prayer. I obviously have a lot of respect for the beauty of the tradition, but as an exemplar of Christianity, I never found it compelling. I mean, it's a fairly ad hoc religion that was designed so Henry VIII could divorce his wife, and the idea that this was the church founded by Christ just never seemed credible to me.
All right, and Jeff in Massachusetts, thanks so much for your email. Here's one from Errol in Goa. Errol says, certain sects of the Jews, that is the people of God, like the Pharisees, already believed in resurrection well before the birth of Christ. How does the resurrection of Christ then change anything? Practically, what difference in the humdrum of our daily lives does the resurrection of Christ make for today's people of God? Regards, Errol from Goa.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate the question. So if the only value in Jesus' resurrection was to demonstrate that there is a resurrection, then I would agree with the premise of your question. Well, they already believed in resurrection. Okay, now we know there's resurrection. No big deal. But that's not the way the New Testament presents the resurrection of Christ. It assigns several specific claims to the resurrection that make it uniquely important. One is that the Jews did not expect a resurrection in time. They expected a resurrection at the end of time. And the Christian belief, the New Testament belief, is that Christ is the first fruits of the resurrection, and he's come in time to inaugurate the kingdom of God. And by his resurrection, God has signaled to the world that he has appointed Jesus the judge of the living and the dead. So Jesus' exaltation, his resurrection, his ascension, his exaltation, is a particular stamp of God's approval upon him and his unique messianic office. So that's point number one. The Jews certainly don't believe that. Another point is that we are mystically joined to Christ, his passion and resurrection, through baptism. We participate in that dynamic of death and resurrection. And so the passion of Christ and his resurrection becomes the pattern of Christian life, dying to ourselves and rising again with him to new life. And so there's a resurrection dynamic that gets built into the fabric of Christian spirituality that is, if not unique, at least a strong point of differentiation from the tenor of Jewish spirituality. So, by Jesus' resurrection and his death and resurrection, Christians believe that Christ conquered death and the power of sin and the devil. And we also share in that. We share in this conquest of the realm of death and of sin and evil, and that power flows into our life and enables us to live as conquerors. So these are significant points of difference.
Yes, indeed. And Errol, thanks for listening to us in Goa. Always very glad to hear from listeners all over the world to this program and all the great programs that you hear here on EWTN. In a moment, we'll be talking with Kelly in Orange County, New York. We have a couple lines open for you as well at 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. Call to communion on this beautiful Tuesday afternoon here on EWTN. Do stay with us.
If it's central to the faith, you can find it on EWTN Podcast Central, featuring the best of EWTN radio, as well as faith-filled podcasts from our friends and affiliates across the nation, all in one place, all free. The destination for great Catholic audio programming is EWTN Podcast Central. It's like podcast heaven. Visit EWTN.com/radio/podcasts today.
This is Life Issues with Brad Mattis, president of Life Issues Institute.
April is Abortion Recovery Awareness Month, and this week I'm sharing the stories of those impacted by abortion and their recovery. Gary said he was self-centered, self-serving, and self-gratifying. And when his girlfriend became pregnant, he believed the lie of abortion at first. Then the weight of it hung over him like an anvil every day, crushing his spirit. Since then, a day never goes by when he doesn't think of his daughter. Every time I hear a child laugh, I cannot help but wonder what your laugh would have been like, or what your favorite flower or color might have been. Like many men, Gary believed the lies, but found hope and healing in Christ. Please visit lifeissues.org for more information and resources for abortion recovery.
For more information, visit our website at lifeissues.org and stay informed, more informed than you've ever been.
Glad you're with us here on EWTN's Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders. We do have a few lines open here at 833-288-EWTN. Do you have a question for Dr. David Anders, something about the Catholic faith that you'd like to know? Maybe you'd like to explain to us why you're not a Catholic yourself and what would be stopping you from becoming a Catholic. In any event, the phone number is 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. We'll get to the phones in just a second here. Let me tell you about a wonderful book available now from EWTN's Religious Catalog. It's called Jesus Himself Drew Near, A Spirituality for Shaping the Lives of Young People by Father Jack Peterson. Is there anything more important in the world than helping young people encounter Jesus and discover the joy of being his disciple? Well, the only way to effectively shape the lives of young people is to fall deeply in love with Christ. In this book, Father Jack Peterson develops a plan to do just that. In particular, he speaks to those who shape the lives of young folks by sharing how to discover how Jesus teaches us to pray in the Gospels. Be inspired by Jesus' parting gift of his mother, Mary, to St. John and to the world. Also, you can gain power from the spirituality of St. Ignatius of Loyola. This is a great book. It's called Jesus Himself Drew Near, A Spirituality for Shaping the Lives of Young People by Father Jack Peterson. It's available right now at EWTNRC.com. Buy Catholic, shop Catholic, EWTNRC.com. If you're ready now, let's go to the phones at 833-288-EWTN. We begin with Kelly in Orange County, New York. And let's see here. Kelly is listening on Sirius XM Channel 130. Hey, Kelly, what's on your mind today?
Hi, thank you for taking my call. I had a question about, can I pray for purgatory for my two sons now while I'm alive and they're alive?
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate that question. So it wouldn't be necessary to pray that they get out of purgatory if they're not in purgatory. What you would do instead is pray that God would grant them grace in this life to persevere and die in the state of grace and holiness, so that they could bypass purgatory and go straight to heaven. That would be what you would want to pray for them.
Yeah, Kelly, you had another question, I believe.
Yes, my youngest son is getting married next summer, and both of my sons are Episcopalian, even though I am Catholic. They were baptized Episcopalian. Can he get married on site, at the wedding site, or does he need to be married in his church?
Yeah, thank you so much. I appreciate the question. So if your son were a Catholic, which he's not, if he were a Catholic, he would be required to marry in a Catholic church in order to have a valid wedding. But the Catholic Church has no position on whether or not, well, actually, they do have a position. Here's the position. For a non-Catholic to have a valid marriage, it is not necessary for them to be married in a Catholic church, right? And so the exchange of vows and the intent to commit oneself to one's spouse in lifelong fidelity for the sake of raising a family is sufficient to contract a valid marriage for a non-Catholic. Now, if that non-Catholic person is baptized, it also affects a valid sacramental marriage. So, there may be canons, laws within the Episcopal Church that would govern his behavior, but the Catholic Church would have no position on those.
There you go. Kelly, thanks so much for your call. Glad to help you with both of those questions. That opens up a line for you right now at 833-288-EWTN. We have two lines open at 833-288-3986. Call to communion on this Tuesday afternoon here on EWTN. Let's go to Linda now in Olympia, Washington, listening on the great Sacred Heart Radio. Hey, Linda, what's on your mind today?
Well, I have a question, and what I'm wondering is if there is somebody who is totally blind and they want to deepen their faith, could they get the Catechism of the Catholic Church in Braille?
I am not 100% sure on that. Well, I was researching your question just right now, and I was doing a quick internet search, and I did come up with some links that suggest the Catechism is out there someplace in Braille. I have no idea how to get it, right? In the meanwhile, you might also consider Father Mike Schmidt's Catechism in a Year.
Yes.
He literally talks you through the entire content of the Catechism.
Good stuff there. Linda, you may want to do a Google search or an internet search on your own there. Just put in Catechism, Catholic, Braille, and that'll probably get you to any possible links there. And thank you so much for your call. Braden called in from Louisiana. He says, Dr. Anders, I have a friend who is coming into the church, but he doesn't believe that it is the church founded by Jesus. He said he's joining because it, quote, checks all his boxes. Is it possible to be Catholic and not believe that Jesus founded the church?
I appreciate the question. So that Jesus founded the church is a dogma of the Catholic faith, and so one is required to believe that. However, I want to take a gentle hand with people who say, well, I don't believe this or that Catholic dogma. And it doesn't mean that I want them to stand up and be lectors and take a public leadership position and host their own podcast and pontificate, right? But if they're not a public person and they're not making a scandal, I want to approach them in a pastoral way, understanding that faith can come in degrees and there can be development, and there can be a gradual approach to the teaching of the church, and a willingness to associate with the people of God and to commit my life to this people and understand that that God is to be found here, and an appreciation that there are degrees of nuance and obscurity that can make it difficult for people intellectually, perhaps, to wrap their head around particular dogmas and fully commit to them, with a kind of intellectual clarity. Personally, I want to allow a certain measure of ambiguity there, that the universal will of God for salvation for all people, and really treat this guy's intention to identify as a Catholic and live a Catholic life, with a fair degree of generosity. I'd have to. What is it he actually denies? I'd like to dig into that and, kind of go through the historical questions with him, find out what his objections are. And so for me I'm not going to pronounce absolutely and say, well, no, he can't possibly be Catholic until I've really investigated where his head is. And again, for me, the very fact that he wants to become Catholic, presumably he intends to find God here. He intends to find Christ here in some authoritative manner. I mean, that counts for a lot.
Sure does. Braden, thanks so much for your question. Michael is watching us on Facebook today. Michael says, could you please explain how one might go about choosing a patron saint? With my name being Michael, I've always assumed St. Michael is my patron saint. Are we supposed to choose one that we feel connected to? And can a person have more than one patron saint?
Okay, thanks. So you are not obligated to have a patron saint. You can get to heaven without a patron saint. But many Catholics, most Catholics, I think, have saints that they identify with, to which they have a special devotion. And having a relationship with the saints in general is not optional. We really do need to have a relationship with the saints, the communion of saints.
Yeah.
And how do you do it? Well, in my life and many people's lives, there's some saint that they've got what you want. Something about their life story connects to yours, and you see how it's possible to be wholly living a particular state of life. So, if you're an attorney, for example, many attorneys have a devotion to St. Thomas More. He was an attorney, and he attained great holiness.
Yeah.
I aspire to be a Catholic scholar, and so the great Catholic scholars in the West are St. Augustine and St. Thomas. So I feel a particular affinity to those fellows because of my mode of life. If you are a woman in a difficult marriage, you might feel drawn to St. Rita of Cascia, for example. If you're a human being on planet Earth and feel like maybe you weren't made for great things, you might be drawn to the little flower Therese of Lisieux, who was all about coming to holiness in the little way. So these are the kind of considerations. And so the thing to do is get to know the saints, and your devotion and your affinity will organically develop out of your study.
And I'm so glad that you mentioned, St. Thomas More, because he's my guy.
He's your guy.
He really is, and maybe it's because I watched that movie at a tender moment in my own life, A Man for All Seasons.
Great film.
Just phenomenal, but there are so many saints that we can all learn from and grow in our own holiness. Michael, thanks so much for your question. Glad that you're watching us on Facebook today. It's called Communion here on EWTN. One line open right now at 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. Interesting email we received from Carlos. Carlos says, we read in the scriptures that the Sanhedrin did not have the power to put a man to death. Therefore, they handed Jesus over to Pilate. However, in Acts, Saul is given authority to persecute even unto death followers of the way. So how are they able to kill a person, Stephen, for instance, in the book of Acts?
That is a great question. I've never considered it, and I don't know. Right? I just don't know. I don't have an answer to that internal conflict. I'd have to go think about it and research it.
Well, was Saul kind of out there on his own, or was he a member of the Sanhedrin?
I mean, the book of Acts does present him initially as operating with the kind of delegated authority.
Okay. So,
And so, while we're talking about it, this
Yeah.
is a possible scenario. I cannot say this is what happened, but during the feast in Jerusalem, when the Romans are really keeping an eye on things, and there's an insurrectionist, it would be convenient for the Sanhedrin, who may not want to carry the heat for themselves, to try to push this thing off on the Romans, who would be more than happy to execute a pretender to royalty. But once, maybe Jesus was a prominent person, they could get a lot of heat for putting him to death, both from the Romans and from the locals. But once that died down, what does anybody care about some guy named Stephen? Right. I mean, it may be just that this is mob rule. When Stephen is stoned, it does sort of have the character of a bunch of people got together and just, roughed him up.
Yeah.
It didn't have quite the judicial weight and public ethos that the execution of Christ would have. So maybe that goes some way to explain the conflict. I don't know. I just hadn't considered it before.
Carlos, thanks so much for your email, and it tickled me a little bit that on his signature line it just says, Carlos, pray, how did he say it? Pray, hope, and don't worry.
Okay.
We should all live by that. Absolutely. All right, back to the phones here at EWTN's Call to Communion at 833-288-EWTN. Jonathan is a first-time caller in Pittsburgh, listening on Sirius XM, Channel 130. Hey, Jonathan, what's on your mind today, sir?
Hi. Again, first-time caller, listened for a long time. Thank you for having me. This might be an interesting or strange question, but my friends and I have talked about it. And it's based off of what the church teaches about the perfected body after the resurrection, and how creation itself is perfected, brought into union with both mankind and God. And it's my understanding that, with our perfected body, we're able to pretty much travel almost as, angels do, that we're not limited to space and time necessarily. So my question is, and this was inspired actually after reading the Space Trilogy by C.S. Lewis, is there a church position on the perfection of creation after the second coming, where we can actually more or less explore the cosmos, so to speak, like just the perfection expand out into beyond Earth itself? And are we able to kind of travel all of creation at that point, not just this planet necessarily?
Yeah, thanks. I like these kind of questions. They're fun.
Yeah.
They're purely speculative, of course. I would qualify one thing in the phraseology. The church doesn't talk about the perfected body, but the glorified body. And there is a subtle difference. I mean, I think you can have a perfect circle, for example. You can actually draw a circle that's, a line or a curve that's equidistant from a point in the middle of a plane. I mean, you can do that. It's perfect insofar as it has all of the properties of the ideal exemplar of the thing in question. You could probably breed a perfect golden retriever. And if you're a Renaissance artist, you could probably capture a perfect human likeness, right?
Yeah.
So perfection doesn't imply this, supernaturally transcendent eternal power, right? And so the language we use is glorification, right? Divinization, that the human person is not just perfected, but taken to a completely different level. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15 that the difference between the resurrected body and our earthly bodies will be analogous to the way different types of animal flesh differ. So we're talking about a specific difference, right? It's not just, ramping up what we have now. It's not becoming the bionic man. It really is a qualitatively different kind of thing. What will the properties of the glorified body be? Well, immortality, for one. Integrity, meaning that the rational intellect will have perfect control over the passions. Mm-hmm. It would seem, Christ passed through doors and did other cool stuff, that maybe there's some cool stuff like that that's on offer. But beyond that, I don't think Revelation gives us much of a hint. Now, the biblical writers themselves, I don't think the Spirit of God revealed to them the secrets of cosmology. I don't think we ought to look to Scripture for an account of, the entirety of the space-time universe. That wasn't their concern. And in the medieval world, there was a belief in something called the Empyrean. When people used to think that the Earth was the center of the universe, they had this image of the Earth being surrounded by these glass spheres, and at the outermost rim, the last level out was called the Empyrean, and beyond that was where God, the saints were alleged to live. Well, now we know that cosmology doesn't work that way, right? The boundaries of our physical universe are not constructed that way, and I don't really think sacred tradition or Scripture contemplates that possibility, although I would not preclude it either, and I'm so glad you're reading C.S. Lewis.
No, absolutely, and as you say, what a fun question.
Fun question.
Absolutely. Jonathan, thanks so much for your call. In a moment, Ed in Iowa, Ann in Melbourne, Florida, Linda in Olympia, Washington, Jonathan in Pittsburgh, all coming up. Stay with us.
For nearly a century, the National Catholic Register has been moving minds, moving hearts, moving souls, and enriching our readers' lives by spreading the truth of the gospel. Today, that tradition continues with award-winning journalism that goes beyond any secular news service, while bringing much-needed light and clarity to the issues and events that affect you and your family's future. All with faithful and courageous reporting guided by the teachings of the Catholic Church. It's more important than ever to join Catholics who depend on the Register. Get 6 free issues today online at ncregister.com/radio or call 800-421-3230 and mention code radio. That's ncregister.com/radio or call 800-421-3230 and mention code radio. The National Catholic Register. Read faithfully.
Through redemptive Catholic journalism, EWTN News helps advance the gospel and teachings of the Church. Get our trusted Catholic news in your email inbox. Sign up today at EWTNnews.com.
By providing quality programming faithful to the teachings of the Catholic Church, EWTN is television that viewers can trust. Whether it's films, documentaries, news coverage, lively discussion shows, or kids programs, we highlight the truth that is the eternal Word. For a complete schedule of EWTN television programs, visit EWTN.com and click TV. EWTN, the Global Catholic Network.
Tomorrow on More to Life, Rise Up.
Weighed down by challenges in your life or relationships? Let us help you rise up.
That's tomorrow on More to Life. Now back to Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders.
Thanks for joining us today here on EWTN's Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders. Our phone number 833-288-EWTN. And speaking of EWTN, we would like to congratulate our great EWTN radio partner in Atlanta. It's AM 1160 The Quest, celebrating 5 years with EWTN. Congratulations to Carol Tearsmith and her great team at The Quest from all of us here at EWTN Radio. All right, let's get back to the phones here for Ed in Iowa, listening to the great Iowa Catholic Radio. Ed, what's on your mind today?
Hello. My question was, why do we refer to Michael the Archangel as Saint Michael the Archangel? And are there other saints or other angels that are referred to as a saint?
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate the question. Michael is a saint because he is holy, and he's holy in a way similar to the way we are holy, namely through sanctifying grace, which is a gift of God, participated experience of God's own nature given to the angels, even as he gives us sanctifying grace. The angels were granted this gift of grace in the first instance of their creation when they obeyed God. Now, they were confirmed in sanctifying grace. Now, there were other angels that were created in sanctifying grace that disobeyed God and said they lost that grace and were not admitted to the beatific vision, never had the vision of God. But the holy angels obeyed God, and they were immediately rewarded with a beatific vision and confirmed in that experience of grace, and therefore they're holy. All of the holy angels are saints, and we only know the names of a few of them, like Michael and Gabriel and Raphael, but if we knew their names, they would all be Saint so-and-so.
Yes, indeed. Appreciate your call. Here is Steve now in Spokane, listening on the great Sacred Heart Radio. Steve, what's on your mind today, sir?
Yeah, hi. So in the Catholic Church, we believe that it's sinful to not go to church on Sunday if we can. But it's certainly prevalent in the evangelical world that you don't have to go to church on Sunday if you'd rather go fishing. So is there other denominations that believe the same as the evangelical world, or when did that start to come about?
Okay, thanks. I appreciate the question. So it's worth noting that the canonical obligation to attend Mass every Sunday and on holy days of obligation universally throughout the Catholic Church was not instituted into the Code of Canon Law until 1917. So it's not like the Code of Canon Law had the Sunday obligation in it from the very beginning.
Interesting.
Now, there were local ordinances and individual bishops and so forth that would, of course, mandate that, but it didn't actually enter into the universal law of the Church until the 17 Code. Now, in Protestantism, there was always a kind of deep antipathy towards canon law. Luther famously burned the Catholic Code of Canon Law and declared he'd lived by the Bible alone. But it's impossible to do that, and so Protestants very early on began to compose their own. They didn't necessarily call them canon law, unless you were Anglican, they did. But they're ecclesiastical ordinances. So John Calvin composed ecclesiastical ordinances for the church in Geneva in 1541, and those governed the ecclesial life of that community. But within Protestantism also there was a tendency to blur the distinction between the civil power and the religious power in a way that was not done in the Catholic Church. And so Protestant polity in civil jurisdiction typically mandated Sabbath observance or Sunday observance in Protestant countries. And so no place would this be more evident than a place like Puritan New England. It was a civil law, not, like I said, the boundaries were kind of blurred. On the civil law books, people had to go to church on Sunday. They'd be fined and sanctioned in other ways if they didn't go to church. Now, I think that the history of the dissolution of that is kind of a piece with the history of secularism. So as secularism advanced in Protestant countries, I think the sense of mandate and obligation diminished, as the civil law was took on a more secular character because they lacked a coherent code of canon law, and they relied on civil legislation for that kind of thing. I mean, I know in the state of Alabama where I live, it wasn't it the 1980s that we finally removed what were called the Blue Laws?
I believe so.
And they didn't mandate church attendance, but they outlawed certain forms of businesses and commercial activity on Sunday. And it wasn't until I think the early 80s that the Alabama legislature, or the Supreme Court rather, finally dismantled that. So there, remnants of that have continued to exist around the world.
Certainly a different world when we had the Blue Laws. I can remember as a kid growing up in St. Louis, everything's closed, period.
Right.
There might be the occasional gas station that was open, but if you just wanted to go for a pizza, forget it, buddy.
Right.
Fascinating. Appreciate your call there, Steve. Maria in Canada called in to say, I've been arguing with my nephews who say that their, quote, self-abuse does not hurt anyone, so it can't be a sin. They're convinced I am wrong when I tell them that those parts of the body have a specific purpose and a time for usage. Can you please help me explain this to them in a better way?
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate the question. So can I talk about the Church's teaching on autoerotic behavior? Yes. Can I convince your nephews? Probably not. And can I help you convince your nephews? Double not, probably, right? I don't know what your relationship to them is, but this is a kind of thing where people are generally not want to take advice from close family members, right?
Yeah.
So, the Church's position on any kind of moral question is ultimately grounded not just in the text of sacred Scripture, but in principles of natural law, meaning what is the natural good of a human person? What can you tell about the nature of the human person as such, and what kind of principles can you derive from that? And, one of the things about our sexual activity is that it's obviously deeply satisfying, it's deeply pleasurable, and you don't have to be a Catholic. In fact, most pagan wisdom traditions would recognize that a life oriented to the pleasure principle is a debased one, and that it deflects us from the pursuit of the virtues and self-control, and the pursuit of justice and certain forms of empathy, and it does tend to kind of warp our conception about the nature of the good, and it also tends to warp our conception of the nature of human sexuality when you're talking about this particular behavior, and what one does in one's in the privacy of one's closet, so to speak, will have an impact when one gets into a marital relationship and the way you conceive about the purpose of the sexual act, and what am I here for? Am I here for my own private gratification, or am I here to make myself, not just in a sexual way, but in the totality of my life, of gift of service or self-donation to somebody else? Now, I'm going to suggest a book to you that is not specifically about this question, although it does touch on it. It's more about the tendency of our culture to have created an environment that is just awash in dopamine, right? Which is the pleasure chemical in the brain. Yeah. And whether it's through sexual activity, or whether it's through drugs and alcohol, or whether it's through video game addiction or television, or whatever craving, whatever your drug of choice is, the way that has really deformed our personalities and our entire culture, and what we can do about it. And this is not written from a Catholic point of view. It's a book that I'm going to recommend by a secular psychiatrist at Stanford. The book is entitled Dopamine Nation: Finding Balance in the Age of Indulgence. And it has a pretty good analysis of what happens when you allow the pleasure principle to take over your life and the things that you can do to counteract that.
I am writing that down myself because I want to read it. It was Dopamine Nation, and the author was?
Anna Lemke, Lembke.
Maria in Canada, thanks for listening, and thanks for sending us your question here on EWTN's Call to Communion. Let's go now to Sue in St. Paul, listening on the EWTN app. Hey, Sue, what's on your mind today?
Hi, Dr. Anders and Tom. Thank you for taking my call. I got a call. My sisters and I were raised Catholic, and one of them left the faith as a young adult and now attends a Presbyterian church affiliated with ECO, a covenant order of evangelical Presbyterians. And recently we were driving together to a family wedding, and she asked me and my husband if we think babies who die in the womb go to heaven. And I responded, of course they do. I guess I had assumed that all Christians believe the unborn go to heaven. But given that some Presbyterian denominations think abortion is okay, I guess it follows that they may not think the unborn go to heaven, as that seems a little contradictory. So I'm wondering if you could clarify the Catholic position and maybe the Protestant position on this issue.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate the question. So the Catholic position is that unborn babies, and for that matter, living babies who are unbaptized, emphatically do not go to hell. The Church has never taught that unbaptized infants go to hell. Now, because of the necessity of baptism for salvation, there have been Catholics that have scratched their heads and asked the question, well, do unborn babies automatically go to heaven, because of some kind of baptism of desire or some sort of implicit baptism? Or is there some other alternative to hell and heaven for those souls? And in the Middle Ages, there were a fair number of theologians that postulated, and this was just a theory, it was never a dogma of the Church, they postulated the existence of a place called limbo, which would be like an eternity in a Caribbean hotel. It was a place of natural happiness that nobody would object to being in, but it wasn't the vision of God. And that was a theory to try to work out this difference between, well, you have to be baptized and they're not baptized, but they haven't sinned, so they can't go to hell. So what are you going to do with them? I guess we'll put them in, we'll put them in limbo. Subsequently, the Church has said, limbo really isn't in divine revelation. It was just a medieval theory, and it's not the dogmatic teaching of the Church, and it's better to presume on the mercy of God and God's universal will to save. And so there's a kind of presumption that the unborn who are unbaptized do in fact go to heaven. If they have no personal sin, God finds a way to extend grace to them outside the normal channels of the sacraments, and they're saved. So that's really the predominant view among Catholic theologians, including the popes today. Now, when it comes to the Protestant position, there's no such thing. Protestants differ wildly from one another on this and many other questions. But I would say that traditional Presbyterianism holds very strongly to a theory called total depravity. And total depravity is a horrible doctrine, in my opinion. This is what total depravity teaches. It teaches that because of the fall of Adam, we not only inherit a propensity to sin and mortality, but we actually personally bear Adam's guilt. And the church does not say that. Catholic Church does not say that. But the classic Protestant position is that we personally bear Adam's guilt, and that the vitiation of our nature is so complete that even with grace, that an individual can do nothing meritorious. Even with grace, every act of the human will is a mortal sin. There are no venial sins. This is the classic Presbyterian view. There are no venial sins. There are only mortal sins. And every conscious act you perform is a mortal sin. So, your Mother Teresa. I'm not making this up. I swear to you I'm not. I mean, I was raised Presbyterian, and I spent 15 years studying Presbyterian theology and wrote a doctoral dissertation on Calvin. I promise you I'm not making this up. But it's so absurd I have to say that. Your Mother Teresa, you help dying people out of the streets of Calcutta. You pull them into a bed and you wash them up and you treat them with dignity and you help them die in peace. That deserves your damnation, because even Mother Teresa's actions are so vitiated by self-love and pride.
Wow.
That even an action like that kind of self-giving intrinsically merits eternal damnation. That's the classic Presbyterian view. Everything you do is filthy rags. I can't tell you how many times I heard that growing up. All our righteous deeds are filthy rags. I heard that biblical verse quoted to me 1,000 times. And in consequence, A, you're so completely vitiated that everything you do is hateful to God, and B, you personally bear Adam's guilt from the moment of your conception. I once read a Puritan sermon, and I wish I could give you the citation. I've long since forgotten which preacher it was, but this is a, say, 17th century New England Puritan preacher who said, if we fell from our mother's womb straight into hell and were there roaring in pain, it would be just.
Wow.
And the classic Presbyterian position is that the infant, the unborn, whoever, right, if they are not of the elect of God, then they, in virtue of their relationship to Adam and nothing else, intrinsically deserve and will receive eternal damnation. I mean, it is a horrible doctrine, but that is what traditional Presbyterianism holds. Now, if your sister's Presbyterian denomination has repudiated classical Reformed theology, more power to them. They've become more Catholic in consequence.
Yeah. Well, there you go. And Sue, thank you so much for your call. Hope that's helpful for you. Call to Communion here on EWTN. This week is a very special week for all of us here at EWTN, and that is because Thursday is the 100th anniversary of the birth of our own foundress, Mother Angelica. And what a wonderful lineup that we are going to be bringing to you. First of all, tomorrow evening at 8 p.m. Eastern, we'll have a roundtable discussion all about Mother Angelica. That'll be along with Father Mitch Pacwa, Doug Keck, Father Joseph, and John Ed Williams. And then on Thursday, which is the actual day, all of our programs, beginning with the Sunrise Morning Show all the way through Catholic Answers Live, will be talking about the life and the work and the legacy of our own dear foundress, Mother Angelica. And one of the special programs on Thursday will be at 10 a.m. Eastern, where Doug Keck and Father Joseph will be sharing their thoughts. We'll have some clips from what Mother had to say about this and that. And then we're going to bring, we'll take you from there live to Rome during that program for a live Mass celebrated by our very own Bishop Stephen Reka from the Diocese of Birmingham here in Alabama, in honor of Mother Angelica's 100th anniversary of her birth. So it's a big deal. It's a big deal and a big day for us here at EWTN. Be sure to join us on Thursday all day long. Right now, let's go to Nancy in Seattle, listening on YouTube today. Hey, Nancy, what's on your mind?
Oh, hi, Dr. Anders and Tom Price. I watch the show almost every day, and I was just thrilled to hear you, Dr. Anders, speaking about in the medieval world, about Imperium and the glass spheres, and that they thought that that's where the saints lived. Now, I just had this thought popped into my mind. I was thinking of Pythagoras and the music of the spheres and his lessons of the 7 crystal spheres and the harmony of the spheres. And I just wondered, is this any kind of an interesting relation to anyway, I just wanted to ask Dr. Anders what his thoughts were on that.
Sure. So the medieval Christians, of course, were not the only people who held these kinds of theories. You can find them in various strands of Hellenistic philosophy, including Pythagoras and Aristotle, and you can find them in Hebrew cosmology as well. So, if you remember the old King James version of the Bible talking about the firmament in the heavens, that's the Hebrew word there is rakia, and we can tell from other contexts in sacred scriptures very much the idea of a sort of a hammered out sheet of glass or metal sphere, and there's actually a vision, I think, of in Ezekiel where the prophet imagines the throne of God seated on the opposite side of this vault that's been placed in heaven. So I'm just speculating here, but phenomenologically, when you look up, you do kind of see a vault in heaven, right? What appears to be one, and so it's sensible to me that many ancient cultures would imagine that was actually a sphere that was lodged up there. I mean, the Babylonians thought that the gods had actually, slain the body of a female god and then set her corpse, as the foundation of the cosmos. So, I mean, these kinds of images appear. Now, if you like this kind of thing, there is a book you've got to read, and it is entitled The Discarded Image. It's by C.S. Lewis. Lewis, of course, was a scholar of medieval and Renaissance literature, and he recognized that the medieval cosmology was false, but he found it so delightful, and he felt like a knowledge of the medieval worldview greatly enhanced one's appreciation of medieval literature. And to that end, he wrote an exposition of the medieval worldview and its cosmology and its literature. And the title of the book tells you his thesis. It's The Discarded Image. It's no longer the way the world functions, right? But it's a delightful exposition of that medieval cosmological vision.
Nancy, thanks for your call. Thanks for listening in Seattle today here on EWTN's Call to Communion. Dave, do you remember earlier in the show we got a question from Braden in Louisiana regarding the friend coming into the church? He doesn't believe that it actually is the church founded by Jesus. Well, Braden called back after your explanation there and gave a little more information to our phone screener. And Braden says that friend has an issue because of his 20 years as a Methodist minister. We didn't know that. Also, he thinks the Catholic Church broke off from the Orthodox.
Okay, yeah, thanks. That I can really go to town on. I appreciate that. So the initial question was, could you be a Catholic if you did not believe in the divine foundation of the church by Jesus?
Right.
And I was that's pretty sketchy, right? Because it's a dogma of the faith that Christ founded the church. But now that I have a little bit more context, I wanted to be generous to the guy before. I want to be even more generous now.
Okay.
Because someone who had that narrative of church history, I think that narrative is incorrect, but it doesn't deny that there was a foundation of the church by Christ. Right. So if you take the Orthodox ecclesial line, you definitely think that Christ founded the Catholic Church. You just think that the Latin instantiation of that is off base. I mean, that's the Orthodox position, right? So they don't deny. Orthodox definitely don't deny that Christ founded a church. They just think the Latins got it wrong. And so again, for me, this is an issue for catechesis. I mean, this is a guy who maybe he needs to be better taught. He needs to read some new books. But if I were his pastor, I would welcome him into the church and then try to bring him along. Great book on that topic, by the way. Rome and the Eastern Churches by Aidan Nichols.
Oh, okay. Very good. Braden, thanks for checking back in with us here on EWTN's Call to Communion. Lourdes watching us on Facebook today. Lourdes says, what does the Catholic Church stand on the neo-catechumenate way?
So, I'm not an expert at all. My memory on this is fairly vague, but I think this is an allowable ecclesial organization within the larger Catholic Church. I mean, that's far from That's far from a total endorsement of everything the movement does. So, there are a lot of ecclesial associations in the church, and they have different charisms, and they have different philosophies, and some people find them useful, and some people want to run for the hills when they see them coming. And that's the freedom of being a Catholic. We're not a monolith.
Lourdes, thank you so much for your question. Here's an anonymous question we received. How does someone discern whether they actually made a valid or invalid general confession? How can one's thoughts increase the gravity of a mortal sin? Can fear, despair, and or presumption lead someone to make a false confession? And finally, can someone be truly repentant and love God, yet make excuses that lead to a false confession? Again, that's an anonymous listener.
Dear soul, how I love you and how bad I feel for you. You are scrupulous. You are scrupulous. You are absolutely scrupulous, right? That you are nitpicking this thing in an unhealthy way. You do not need to go there. So here's my recommendation to you. The Council of Trent says, confess your known mortal sins in kind and number, right? It does not say that you have to penetrate every shade and nuance of thought and parse and dissect your every whim and emotion down to the last neuron in order to try to evaluate its gravity. And that level of scrutiny is unhealthy in my judgment. What I would do is a kind and number of those. And look, here's a temptation that scrupulous people have. They would take an action that anybody else, any sort of man on the street, or even good practicing Catholic would regard as trivial or not serious. And they would say, well, yeah, I know it's not serious in this person's case, but in my case it's grave because, and they begin to add a whole bunch of elaboration and nuance to try to massage a grave sin out of what is otherwise a venial situation, right? If you find yourself needing to justify your claim that you're a grave sinner, well, listen, Father, let me explain to you why this is so bad. That is a clear sign of scrupulosity. So what I would do is you need to find a wise, sound confessor. Say, look, I'm scrupulous. I need you to help me with it. I'm going to come to confession to you only. And when you tell me to shut up and not confess this thing again, I'm not going to confess it again. Obedience to a good confessor is the way you get over scrupulosity. It's just another form of obsessive-compulsive disorder.
Yeah.
And exposure is the way you get over those obsessions and compulsions. You gradually allow yourself to make what you think is a bad confession that your confessor is perfectly happy with. He's not telling you it's a bad confession, right? Until you become habituated to a mode of life that's not so neurotic.
I had a friend years ago who was talking about this very thing, and he said, I know that I'm overly scrupulous. I know it.
It's a torture.
It has to be.
This is a torture.
Yeah. Tough stuff. Wow, there you go. And thank you so much for your email. Hey, Dr. David Anders, great show. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Tom.
We do this show Monday through Friday, 2 p.m. Eastern, right here on EWTN Radio. We also encore that for you at 11 p.m. Eastern, which is 8 p.m. on the West Coast. You can check out the podcast anytime you wish by going to EWTNradio.net, EWTNradio.net. On behalf of our fantastic team here, I'm Tom Price along with Dr. David Anders. Thanks so much for your company. Looking forward to our next visit. I personally hope that is tomorrow right here on EWTN's Call to Communion. Have a great day and God bless.